Beyond Borders. I'm Morton Satin. I've spent several decades in the field for the United Nations in developing countries, and I just wanted to let everybody know that here in Sacramento, in old Sacramento, this is where the whole concept of the United Nations started. And it was started by an individual by the name of David Lubin.
H.G. Wells, perhaps the foremost English social commentator of the 20th century, said this about the unknown Sacramentan who envisioned world peace and did something about it. If ever the history of this great revolution in human affairs that may now be in progress should come to be written, there must be at least a vignette of that prophetic American. David Lubin. It was he who had invented the original League of Nations. H.G. Wells, 1918. David Lubin's ideas were novel during his time, and the notion of international cooperation to solve global issues was at the forefront of everything that he did. Without David Lubin's work towards international diplomacy, we would not have the United Nations that we know today. The year 2020 marks the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, a tireless institution that is best known for peace building, peacekeeping, conflict resolution, and humanitarian assistance. The UN works on a broad range of international fundamental issues, from sustainable development, environment and refugees protection, disaster relief, human rights, and much more, all in order to achieve its goals of making the world a better place, especially for future generations. David Lubin had a key role in shaping the renowned institution that we know today, and this is his story.
We have to go back to the year 1849, into the Pale of Settlement, a specific area in Russia where the government forced its Jewish population to live. The goal of this discriminatory policy was to repress this population and isolate it from the rest of the country. The Pale contained much of what is Poland today, and David Lubin was born into this poverty in the town of Kladova, west of Warsaw. Because of the anti-Semitism prevalent in the Pale of Settlement, and the very real physical threat of harm and death resulting from pogroms, the frequent violent attacks aimed at Jews, the Lubin family decided to escape and emigrate to the United States via England when David was 3 years old. 18 years later, at the age of 21, David moved out west to California. He created the largest, most successful department store and mail-order business west of Chicago, right in Sacramento. He implemented these tremendous worker compensation programs. The workers had profit sharing. The women were all escorted home at night, all free of charge, of course. And he had a program where he taught all employees in the evening. They were able to take night classes free of charge, and those that did well, of course, advanced in his company. He always felt that he should share whatever his fortune was with those that were less fortunate. This is the story of what he did and how it ended up being the basis for the United Nations. He brought in his brother to help him run the store. Eventually, Lubin decided to branch out into farming. But when he saw how poorly farmers were treated by traders and speculators, he decided to devote his life and his fortune to assisting farmers in California and around the world. And in fact, became one of the most successful fruit producers in Northern California. But the problem was that they couldn't really sell fruit outside of the state because of the rather onerous conditions. that the railroad barons had placed on food exports. He felt that this was wrong for everybody. Lubin was not a believer in a zero-sum solution. He wanted everybody to gain from any success. So he went out east and he convinced in one afternoon these railroad barons to totally change their attitude towards the farmers and start shipping fruit out east at a very reasonable price. This changed the entire economy of Northern California. He treated his employees very, very well. And on the farm itself, he had the first benefits program for migrant workers. Number one, he paid them decent salaries. Number two, he provided them with excellent housing facilities. And number three, he made certain that their children had access, free access, to schooling while these workers were employed in the field. Now, a lot of people said that he was insane to spend so much money on his workers, but his attitude was he had the most loyal workers available. And the following year, they would come right back to his farm to work, and they would be producing the most carefully prepared and picked fruit and vegetables available because they were so loyal to him. And of course, he was loyal back to them. But at the same time, he wanted the city of Sacramento to enjoy the benefits of his success in creating, along with Mrs. Margaret Crocker, the famous Crocker Art Museum. Again, the most sophisticated art museum west of Chicago. David was a great believer in the idea of knowledge being power and wanted to establish an international institute of agriculture to provide farmers around the world with the critical crop production and distribution information that they needed in order to market their products and free themselves from the control of international traders and speculators. David Lubin was a very unusual man for his time. David Lubin did not see among people any barriers related to color, creed, religion, you name it. To him, all people were the same and all were deserving of an opportunity of making their lives better. And the most important rule that Lubin really believed in, the golden rule. Treat others as you would like to be treated. And that was the basis of his entire morality. And when he eventually applied it to the United Nations, that was the first step in getting people to understand that if they all believed in the same thing, then they could in fact trust one another. And to this day, if that rule is followed, we have great successes within the United Nations. And the times that we don't have successes is when people feel, or they don't feel rather, obliged to follow that rule.
This is Washington, D.C. D.C. now stands for Domestic Confidence. Washington is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. It is named after a man who never told a lie. Now it's filled with men who seldom tell the truth. Washington was laid out by a commission of 4 in 1791. It's been laid out by the rest of the country ever since.
He first tried to seek help in Washington, but was rebuffed because at the time, the U.S. government held strong isolationist views. So Lubin then traveled to Europe to try and find assistance from other governments. He was turned away from most until he met King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy, who thought his ideas were excellent and decided to support them. At a meeting of many governments in Rome in 1906, the International Institute of Agriculture, or the IIA, was approved and opened its doors in the Eternal City, Rome, in 1908. David's IIA concept was an enormous international success. It started with 40 member governments and quickly rose to 60 within 3 years. Everyone, without exception, regarded the IIA as a shining example of international cooperation. David Lubin, the young man who went from rags to righteous, achieved the creation of the first large intergovernmental organization in the world. Throughout his life experience, Lubin had always been troubled that the only way people managed to deal with conflict was through violence. Nothing seemed to have changed from the dawn of time. He considered the work of the IIA, where member governments sat around the table and debated solutions to joint problems in agriculture. He felt that if governments could get together to discuss agriculture, they certainly should be able to discuss conflicts and peace in the same way. He put his thoughts together and created the concept of a Confederation of Democracies under a constitution that could do the same for world peace that the IIA had done for world agriculture. All problems of agriculture were discussed by a great number of nations, sitting around the table and coming up with solutions. Lubin felt that if they could discuss agriculture in such a positive way, why couldn't they discuss the far more important issue of world peace, in which he described an organization similar to the International Institute of Agriculture, but devoted to the idea of peace rather than simply discussing agriculture. He wrote up that paper in 1910, and it was the very, very first description of the League of Nations. In 1910, he sent his concept to William Stead, who was the most famous British journalist of the time. Stead was very impressed and corresponded with David over the issue for the next 2 years. Stead decided to write several articles on the matter upon his return from a trip to the United States. On April the 10th, 1912, Stead boarded the Titanic for his voyage. Needless to say, the articles and Stead's strong support never materialized. After Stead's death, David self-published his concept for an international confederation of democracies under a constitution, the very first representation of the League of Nations. Unfortunately, David's confederation concept was generally ignored. Now, no one really took great notice of Lubin's idea in 1910 because the world was not at war, and they did not feel that they had to come up with a solution to discussing peace. For much of the 19th century, the major European powers had tried to maintain a balance of power among themselves, resulting in a series of secret military and political alliances. At the same time, suspicions among the major powers led to a significant arms race. The combination of secret alliances, the proliferation of deadly weapons, nationalist ambitions, and historical distrust made Europe a cauldron of tension, ready to boil over into conflict. In 1914, that's exactly what happened. More than 70 million military personnel and countless civilians were mobilized, making it the greatest and deadliest war in the history up till that time. The estimated casualties of World War I, or the Great War, were 22 million deaths and more than 23 million wounded, once again showing the terrible consequences of violence as a means of settling disputes. When the world understood that war was a devastating approach to settling conflict, it was open to alternative thinking, including Lubin's Confederation concept. In 1910, Woodrow Wilson was the president of famous East Coast University, and nowhere involved at that time, directly involved anyway, in politics. At the end of World War I, Woodrow Wilson appropriated Lubin's Confederation idea, and he refashioned it simply by adding a few specific points. Lubin did not want to add any specific points, he just wanted the general principle to be understood. But Wilson added a few specific points. He added a 14-point plan which specified certain actions such as absolute freedom of the seas, removal of economic and trade barriers, an end to arms races, etc., and renamed the concept the League of Nations. While Wilson received a Nobel Prize for the League of Nations, he gave no credit at all to Lubin, who had originated the idea. And the only one that ever gave credit publicly to David Lubin was the most famous social philosopher of the English language, H.G. Wells. Wells went on to say that it was Lubin who had created the original League of Nations, not Woodrow Wilson. Just after Christmas, in 1918, Lubin was struck down with the Spanish flu in Rome. He died 4 days later on January the 1st, 1919. On the very same day, Woodrow Wilson and his full entourage of Americans were in Rome to promote the League of Nations. Lubin was buried in Rome's Verano Cemetery 2 days later, and thousands of people from all walks of life and diplomats from many world countries attended the funeral. But not a single American could be seen. With the failure of the League of Nations, we ended up going into World War II, which was an even far greater disaster than the Great War. So you have to have a little bit of faith in other people, and you have to have a little bit of generosity that you give to other people, so that in fact we can cooperate for the sake of justice and for the sake of our very existence. Why didn't the United States join? Because they did not want to give away any of their autonomy to other countries. They just did not trust other countries. It was a failure because of lack of trust. And one thing we know is that the only way we can get things done is if we trust one another. Before the end of World War II, the Allies, led by the United States, recognized the need for an international organization to mediate disputes.
Meanwhile, in San Francisco, delegates of 50 nations had met to form the United Nations organization. President Truman came from Washington for the signing of the historic charter. Foreign Minister Molotov of the Soviet Union lent his presence to the solemn and hopeful expression of man's resolution to live in peace. The nations were united. The Big Five, China, Russia, Britain, France, and the United States, led the peoples of the world as they launched a rule of international law and a Bill of Human Rights, a rule of law they believed no nation, large or small, would dare defy. The United Nations was set up, a tribunal empowered to mediate international disputes.
Our world is facing issues it has never seen before. The climate is changing rapidly. Major transformations in technology and the makeup of our population are underway. Inequality is growing, and we face risks from long-running conflicts and new forms of violence. Solutions to these issues will require cooperation across borders, sectors, and generations. On the 75th anniversary of the United Nations in 2020, people from all walks of life are coming together to discuss global challenges and solutions.
What are the big issues facing our world?
That's a big question.
Poverty that comes from inequity.
There's just a really huge divide right now in the world between the very rich and the very poor.
Forced migration and displacement is a common thread everywhere.
Et toi, qu'est-ce que tu penses que le monde actuel fait face?
Peut-être.
Well, I want the young people to understand that problems such as the COVID-19 pandemic, problems such as global warming, are soluble. They can be solved. And there are some very, very good concrete examples of this. First of all, we have to understand that there have been many diseases that we have wiped out through international cooperation. With the World Health Organization of the United Nations, there have been several pandemics around the world that have been eliminated.
What are some of the examples of the United Nations' successes through global partnership and cooperation? Well, take smallpox for example, a deadly and devastating disease caused by two viruses, which was the focus of the World Health Organization global eradication effort. As a result, the disease was completely eliminated from the globe by 1980. Other examples include HIV or AIDS, the Ebola virus and the Marburg virus. Although not totally eradicated, they are largely under control through global efforts by the World Health Organization. Without the WHO, the world will never be rid of COVID-19. It is also important to remember that diseases do not exist or occur in a vacuum.
The UN agencies, Food and Agricultural Organization, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and the United Nations Development Program supported the consultative group on international agricultural research, who introduced new yielding varieties of wheat, maize, and rice that were able to grow in tropical countries. Along with newer methods of cultivation, this great leap in agricultural production prevented the starvation and death of millions of poor people in developing countries.
I think women still remain the most marginalized group of people within my community. Women still have to bend their backs to get things done and to get what they truly deserve.
I already faced racism in my daily life, where I was bullied because of my skin.
What can you really do? And does it really matter?
Я слышала, что некоторые люди уезжают из-за войны, потому что им начинается война в их стране, им некуда деваться, и они переезжают.
Refugees are not statistics, they are people. They did not become refugees by choice. Who knows what tomorrow holds? As much as we pray against violence, there could be a natural disaster tomorrow, and I also become a refugee.
The UN was responsible for developing the peaceful path for the development of independence for dozens of former colonies. Although some countries continue to struggle, they are under the watchful eye of the United Nations, which continually encourages the development of more democratic and less corrupt governments.
The changing climate remains one of the most daunting challenges that the world faces. From the releasing of an excess amount of gases that cause a greenhouse warming effect, to the phasing out of carcinogenic and ozone depleting chemicals, the United Nations serves as a meeting ground for all countries' efforts to eliminating these threats.
国家方面的话，就因为气候的变化导致很多的极端天气，然后带来了很多的一些自然灾害，导致了有些地方的人就是流离失所，造成了很严重的一些经济损失。
We're getting an increasing number of large storms that are causing our floods levels to rise, making it cost prohibitive for people to live in our communities where they've lived for generations.
People are going to have to start making hard decisions about how to either protect the shoreline from rising water levels or relocate.
I mean, we are facing a global problem, so I think the important task is to face that problem all together.
There's no way to resolve the crisis we have at hand without holding the biggest emitters accountable.
We need to understand the causes of climate change so that we can mitigate against it getting worse. On the flip side, there is a need to have adaptable technologies.
What steps can we take to solve climate change?
从减少生活上的能源消耗，还有就是减少排放。
Another thing is most young people don't remember what we refer to as the hole in the ozone layer. There was a huge hole created in the ozone layer in the south near the Antarctic, and everyone was worried, this was back in the 1970s, that this was going to be a catastrophe of a tremendous proportion, because without the ozone, a tremendous amount of ultraviolet light comes down and people will be exposed to it. But the United Nations gathered all the countries together And they all signed on to something called the Montreal Protocol, which was really designed to eliminate certain propellants that are placed into certain spray cans. And the world agreed that because this was causing a hole in the ozone layer, they should not produce it, all under the aegis of the United Nations. It's 25 years later, or more, and there is no longer a hole in the ozone layer. So you must understand that we can do things, but it's critical that young people understand that they have to join into the whole concept of the United Nations and demand that all countries sign on to the protocols that are necessary to prevent these things from getting worse.
If we have it in our power to cure the world's ills, we should not waste time blaming the past.
Everybody will want to seize the opportunity to get educated, but not everybody has access to that because of the cost of schooling or education.
There's no denying that there's an increase in homelessness in the city, yet even I find myself, what can we do? You know, like something is internally or externally wrong with what's going on worldwide that people are suffering, and there's this gap.
My grandmother in Chicago, she fed the homeless for 20 years. Finding a way to be part of any sort of small incremental solution creates so much change.
You don't have a place to sleep. I will tell you to come and sleep in my place. We should give shelter. We should give refugee, you know, we should give food to them.
Хороший. Больше хорошего, наверное, чем плохого.
你希望在社群里看到为一个公正平等的社会做出怎样的努力？
I want to see real diversity of people in all industries.
I would love to see the planet being protected. I mean, we really don't have anywhere to go.
Я бы хотела, чтобы стали бороться с болезнями, которые нельзя вылечить, чтобы их можно было вылечить, чтобы появились новые технологии, которые будут помогать человеку.
这个的话，就是我希望在人们在看到一些不公正的一些事情的时候，能够勇敢地站出来。
Why is global cooperation important?
التعاون الدولي مهم إلنا كلنا ومهم كتير لتقدم الإنسان والإنسانية في مجال من الصحة للتعليم إلى القضاء على الفقر وخلق فرص أعمال خاصة للشباب ومهم كتير كمان لتحقيق الأمن والسلام.
The world remains a global village. What affects one part of the world invariably affects every other part of the world.
And so it's talking to each other, you know, we open the door for different understanding, but also the understanding that we all are pretty much in the same plight and looking for the same answers.
Countries from all over the world need to come together to essentially talk about the issues that really matter and be able to listen, empathize, as well as understand each other's problems.
How do we shape our future together?
Обсуждая.
By talking.
By listening.
与倾听.
By listening. We must join together under the banner of the United Nations and express the true meaning of solidarity. The future is up to us.
Get active. Join the United Nations Association. Play your part in the solution.
You can make a difference. You can help. But don't leave it to past generations and don't complain about past generations. Get in and get involved yourself. You can do things. If you get involved actively, you will see the positive results in a very short time. The United Nations is the only organization that represents the entire globe. We have to think beyond borders.
David Lubin's ideas were novel during his time. One second. Guys,
Just take a breath.
This is intense. Sorry. Yeah.
United Nations has served as because I like said it almost. Okay.
How loud did you do it? Were you like, did you talk it? I can't remember. Were you like, the future is up to us, or do you want like, the future is up to us?
I didn't smile.
You got it. You got to try one more time. Tireless institution that is best known for.
Is my hands alright? I felt like a T-Rex in there. Just kind of.
That was good.